Welcome, and thank you all for joining us once again for our final ACMRS Roundtable of the fall semester on the future of medieval disability studies. I'm Jeff Way, the manager of publishing futures for ACMRS. I first want to once again extend a huge thank you to ASU's Institute for Humanities Research for their generous funding of many of our 2020-2021 digital events. And I hope you'll all join us for our final event of the fall semester, Runaway Ecologies with short-term resident Gabriel Roca, and for our next Race Before Race conference on education in January. For those of you interested, the Race Before Race education program is now available online, and registration for the conference is going to open this coming Monday, November 23rd. You can find out information about both of these events on our website, and also be sure to sign up for our mailing list to get updates on our full spring event schedule at acmrs.asu.edu/about if you haven't done so already. And if you would like to help in supporting more events like these, please do consider going to acmrs.asu.edu/give to make a donation if you're able to do so. As we've now been living in the COVID-19 pandemic for most of this year without a clear end yet in sight, we've seen a lot of work over the past several months that has turned our attention to pandemics of the past to help understand our current moment. Many of the voices in these conversations have come from pre-modern studies, and one of the constant points that has stuck out to me in these discussions and considerations of the past is that they should not be just about the past. They should be helping us understand both our present and our future. The four brilliant scholars joining us today, Cameron Hunt McNabb, Rick Godden, Kristina Richardson, and Jonathan Shu, are deeply invested in such work. As you'll hear from them today, our visions of what the future of medieval disability studies needs has to be robust, diverse, intersectional, collaborative, and more. The futures we might envision have to account for where we've come from and where we are now if we hope to create different, more inclusive futures in our fields and beyond. As always, given our speakers' extensive lists of accomplishments, I won't spend time today reading their bios, but we have made them available for you on our website, and I encourage you to find them there. Today's event will be live captioned, and if you want to take advantage of this, just click on the CC button on the bottom of your screen. You can also pose questions for today's speakers through the Q&A button on Zoom, and we of course encourage live tweeting today's event using the ACMRS events hashtag. In the first part of today's event, each of our speakers will deliver a short talk, and then from there we're going to open it up to the conversation and your questions, so please ask them as they come to you. Now, I'm excited to turn it over to today's first speaker, Cameron Hunt McNabb.
Thank you. I'm Cameron Hunt McNabb, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and my handle on Twitter is Cameron McNabb. And the title of my talk today is Transtemporal, Transcultural Medieval Disability Studies. So I'd like to begin by thanking Ayanna Thompson, Leah Newsom, Jeffrey Way, and all of the support that ACMRS has provided for the panel. I'm delighted to be here with my fellow participants, and it's a privilege to be in a square alongside them. This mode of our gathering, these squares on a screen, remind us, as if we could have forgotten, that we are in the middle of a global pandemic. Rather suddenly, central issues that disability studies has engaged with, like health privacy, accommodations, and accessibility, have zoomed to the forefront of mainstream life. For shame, it took a pandemic for them to do so. But this current moment speaks all the more to the significance of critical disability studies. But where does medieval disability studies fit in with this? Beyond the time of pandemic historical affinity, I think that there are some broader avenues where the period can speak to the present and the present can speak back. The field began by carrying the critical conversation backwards in time to before disability's supposed advent in the Enlightenment. It is time to carry it forwards as well. I believe that transtemporal dialogue, one that harkens to Geraldine Hang's notion of oscillating and overlapping historical time, is a crucial part of the future of the field. I, like many now, begin my day by logging my COVID check into my institution's system, a daily reminder of what disability studies calls universal impairment. We are all one cough away from being impaired. The medieval Christian church believed that we were not just one cough, but one piece of fruit away from impairment. So while the field-defining work of Irina Metzler has demonstrated that medieval Christianity did not always or uniformly equate disability with sin, it did subscribe to the doctrine of original sin. and original sin invites a bodily corollary, what I like to call original frailty. Such frailty in the medieval Christian framework existed within a web of economic, political, sociocultural, and moral power structures, what Edward Wheatley calls the religious model. Posed as ancestral to the modern medical model, these structures were far more intersectional than the more siloed ways that we delineate disability now. But our current moment has shown us how pervasive and intersectional modern disability really is, existing in a web of power structures more closely resembling those of the medieval church than the modern medical community. Medieval disability studies has already been doing this kind of intersectional, interdisciplinary work, and that work is all the more important for providing transtemporal models for the present. Yet it is here that I turn to my second point. We are in a global pandemic. Medieval disability studies must not just be transtemporal, but it must also be transcultural and transgeographic. My medieval informed readings of our current moment are rooted in a predominantly Western medieval disability studies. Indeed, the field leaned Western in its earliest inception, not unlike medieval studies more broadly, though this is not to discount the incredible work on the global Middle Ages already out there, which I will turn to in a moment. The Western slant has heavily shaped the theoretical frameworks that have defined the field, such as Metzler's analyses, Wheatley's religious model, and Torrey Pearman's gendered model. These scholars of Western texts, like me, have worked in an insular, pun intended, cycle of Western texts, speaking to Western disability frameworks applied to more Western texts. This cycle marginalizes scholars of other traditions as they attempt to export these poorly fitting frameworks to global medieval texts. Or if they eschew the frameworks altogether, they face gatekeeping or exclusion from the field. But medieval disability studies needs to acknowledge how limited and contextual our current frameworks are. And we need to support global scholars in developing work in other traditions that can speak back to our Western informed ones. Just as one example, Kristina Richardson, my co-participant on this panel, and others have already done incredible work on disability and Islamic texts, and their work invites even further inquiry outside the Abrahamic tradition. So just as the field expanded disability's transtemporal conversations back to the pre-modern period, it must also expand its current conversation culturally and geographically. So what questions might a transcultural medieval disability studies pose? It might ask how other religious traditions outside of Christianity coded and controlled disability. It might ask how other cultures constructed a normate, or if a normate is even a universal phenomenon. It might ask how other non-Aristotelian constructions of gender intersect with disability. I would like to end on practical notes. First, we've drafted a bibliography on global medieval disability studies to share as a way to amplify the work that's already been done and to see what further inroads can be made by global scholars. This has been posted on the Medieval Disability Glossary and tweeted out by ACMRS. Secondly, there are already avenues for this kind of work, transtemporal and transcultural work, that could be further developed. The Medieval Disability Glossary has space for disability-themed introductions to primary texts geared towards classroom use. The collection is in its infancy, and it could be a vital space to explore disability in global medieval texts and support their use in the classroom. Such work could also contribute to publishing other medieval disability sourcebooks within more traditions beyond the one on Western Europe that is already available. Now, I am looking forward to exploring all of these ideas more in my co-panelist talks and the Q&A afterwards. So now I hand it off to Rick Godden.
All right. First, I am so thankful to be here with my fellow panelists. I'd also like to thank Ayana, Leah, and Jeff for inviting me to be here. As I have been thinking through what I would like to say in my remarks today, one thing that keeps recurring to me is the surprising fact that I am even here participating in this event at all. As an academic who is also a wheelchair user, travel is often difficult and time-consuming. So to travel from Baton Rouge, Louisiana to Arizona in the middle of the semester would have been previously unthinkable. But in the age of the pandemic, we are temporarily virtual. And with that virtuality comes many shortcomings, but also possibility. While we are all eager to be out in the world again, the pandemic has compelled us to imagine new ways of being together, new modes of connection. Most importantly for my remarks today, the pandemic has also provoked me to think differently about my own connection to my field of study, that is to say, medieval disability studies. As someone living in the 21st century in a pandemic, what is my relationship to the medieval past? What is my obligation to it? How does that past speak to and pressure our own? Where do we go from here? To answer these questions, I would simply say that the future of medieval disability studies is now. I'm thinking of a polychronic now, such as Carolyn Dinshaw describes. Quote, the present moment is more heterogeneous and asynchronous than the everyday image of now would allow. This conception allows me to sidestep prognostications that demarcate a future from some past. The remarks I wish to make today, therefore, follow in the work already being done by medievalists who work on disability. It also recognizes that the study of medieval disability has almost always been marked by asynchrony. As Irina Metzler has observed, there was no umbrella term for the category of disability as we would consider it in the Middle Ages. As a result, anyone working on medieval disability needs to have a certain double-mindedness, historicizing while applying modern vocabulary and concepts. Medieval disability studies has always happened in crypt time, a queer temporality that is asynchronous, multiple. Crypt time, so insightfully explored by Alison Kaffer and Alicia Spencer Hall and others, is embodied, connective, and generative. In thinking about my polychronic relation to the past, I keep dwelling on two representations of disability in the Middle Ages. The first comes from the miracle depositions from the First Papal Commission on Elizabeth of Hungary, where we meet a man named Arnulf. Arnulf was, quote, crippled in one leg so that he was not even able to sit in upright manner. He supported himself with specially fashioned crutches, without which he was unable to get around except by crawling, which is what he did in his own house. He remained this way for about a year. On the last feast of St. Michael, he made his way to the tomb of the Lady Landgraven, and after invoking the grace of God and Elizabeth's assistance, he was restored to health and returned home without crutches. Now, this is a fairly common episode of miraculous healing in the Middle Ages, and yet I can't help but linger over the details of these specially fashioned crutches that he possesses, that someone must have made for him, and the fact that he navigates his own home in a different way than he does the outside world. This especially resonates for me as I have barely left my own home since March, and have really given new thought to how I occupy this space. The other example that comes to mind is the healing of Sir Uri in Malory's Morte Arthur. Here, Sir Uri can only be healed by the best knight, and so he is poked and prodded, almost comedically so, by approximately 110 knights of the Round Table. Finally, he is healed by Lancelot, but only after this almost never-ending list of would-be healers. On one hand, Malory is giving us a roll call of the Round Table before it is shattered. But in my own anachronistic meditations, I can't help but remember, excuse me, I can't help but remember being a child and having my neurologist be flanked by what felt like 110 would-be doctors as they examined me. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that our analysis end with such superficial connections between past and present. But this kind of trans-temporal identification enables me to focus more on the lived experience of these disabled and chronically ill figures. By dwelling in the moments before miraculous healing, I can recognize lived experiences that not only resonate with my own, but must surely have spoken to the everyday life of the impaired in the Middle Ages more than a miraculous cure might. Alison Kaffer, in thinking about a sense of crypt time, argues, quote, how one understands disability in the present determines how one imagines disability in the future. One's assumptions about the experience of disability creates one's conceptions of a better future. We might amend this slightly to read, how one understands disability in the past determines how one imagines disability in the future or even the present. Like Cameron, I might end with just a few practical suggestions for what I would like to see in a possible future of medieval disability studies. I would like to see more transtemporal identification, more consideration of medieval and modern materials alongside each other. I would like to see scholars and activists draw on the past to inform the present and to imagine better futures. Thinking about the polychronic nature of such a now for medieval disability studies would ensure that the study of disability in the past does not become entirely divorced from the roots of the field, which are oriented toward activism and justice. To do this, however, I also think that we need to make the critical study of medieval disability more accessible, and we need more representation from those who identify as disabled or chronically ill. The same, of course, can be said for virtually any field in academia today. This is not to say that there aren't disabled academics, nor am I saying the kind of work I am imagining can only be done by academics who are disabled. What I am saying is that we need to think about how to make the work we do, scholarship, events, employment, how to make this work more open, more welcoming, more accessible, and more livable. Thank you, and I would like to hand off now to Kristina.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, okay. Well, thank you, Rick. So in my own comments, first I want to thank Ayana, Jeff, and Leah for the invitation. And just to begin, so in this moment of suspension, it's been a really disorienting challenge, actually, to try to imagine disciplinary futures. So on the one hand, I feel very hopeful because disability studies has built a great infrastructure and professional visibility, and emerging scholars have flocked to the subfield of medieval disability studies. So we have journals, themed journal issues, conferences, and professional organizations. And medievalists appear prominently in all of these. So this groundwork should be a perfect launching pad for imagining the direction of a field. But on the other hand, with severe contractions in higher education and a cratering academic job market, it does make imagining futures feel, as Susan Sontag said of viewing war photography, like quote, unquote, helpless voyeurism. So what futures are we able to imagine? And when I first began pondering this question, I wanted to acknowledge the coronavirus pandemic as an opportunity to reimagine not only our societies, but also our fields. Can this period of widespread illness and death encourage empathy? Will specialists in medieval disability studies no longer need to argue for the field, for its inclusion in the pantheon of humanity and human topics? But we see in the United States, at least, a resigned acceptance, of the disposability of ill, disabled, and even deceased bodies. So here's what I imagine. Soon we will see fewer hires of junior faculty on the tenure track. We will still see mid-career and senior professors shuffling between universities, but that movement may be the only dynamism left. As such, we should consider that the same people that we see even on this call, or who are invited to speak on these subjects and write in collected volumes, that these same people will represent the conversation for the next decade. And these conversations will become rather insular, with low stakes for outreach or for innovation. Challenges and new questions come from wider conversations, new energy. So what is a field with only or mostly tenured faculty with research funding? Quickly, it starts to resemble medieval models of education with elite university careers and everyone else needing to retrain for, in the modern period, academic staff and administrative posts or non-academic career altogether, perhaps in disability advocacy. We start to feel as though we're living in the Thomas Hardy novel, Jude the Obscure, some of us looking helplessly and longingly upon the hallowed halls of Oxford, and others gliding through these halls in plush academic robes. Now, I currently work in another field, medieval Romani Gypsy history, that has experienced similar disruptions, historically led by European scholars who lost their university positions because they were Jews or sympathized with their Jewish compatriots. So between roughly 1938 and 1985, the field of Romani studies lay dormant and is only recently reemerging with new scholarship. But in these nearly 50 years, 50 inactive years, the field has missed the linguistic turn, the application of genetic insights, critical race theories, and much more. There has been nothing short of a massive erosion of the depth and breadth of the field. And the accumulated wisdom of scholars of Romani history was long ignored. Of course, medieval disability studies today is not facing such catastrophic disruptions as genocide and warfare, but such historical examples might help us anticipate and react to the current crisis. So thinking through the topic of future disability studies against the backdrop of these evolving conditions of employment led me to then ask, what parts of our field of medieval disability studies are worth saving? The core principle of disability studies is that disability is determined by environments and not bodies. A ramp and automatic doors advantage every visitor to a building and disadvantages no one. So that ethos is one to maintain of accessibility. So in that spirit, I propose 5 suggestions or questions as we think about the future. First, institutions and organizations should certainly continue hosting virtual conferences and posting lectures online to push back against exclusivity. Reconsider the closed workshop. Commit to opening up existing networks. Secondly, and this is something that other panelists have touched on with more depth than I can, but medieval disability studies has still not produced enough work on global populations. Of course, many scholars have acknowledged the 20th century Euro-American political roots of disability studies and know that these concepts are difficult to translate to other times and places. Most of the societies we study were far more communally oriented, so less individualistic than our own, and the language for a quote disabled person may not have existed. In my own work with classical Arabic sources, disability was constructed as an aesthetic category premised on the normative dark-haired, dark-eyed Arab. As such, blue and green-eyed people were included in lists of people with blighted bodies. So again, opening up conversations about the global. Thirdly, see where new intellectual centers pop up. Much has been made of the movement out of cities during the pandemic. Corporate America is reconsidering the need for office space, urban or otherwise. Workers are resettling in more livable locations. So in our context, if, say, US higher education stagnates or contracts, where do we find new communities of thinkers? Fourthly, collaborations may not be with university professors on academic books and projects, but with high school textbook authors, journalists, and independent scholars on books and television documentaries. Freelance writers who produce academic copy may work together on these topics. So how do we start to formalize these networks and professionalize these networks? And fifthly, how do we incentivize senior scholars to collaborate with junior scholars? I know that other panelists will discuss the mechanisms of collaboration and its utility for the field, but who needs convincing? In such a cutthroat environment where research awards, funds, and positions are going to be hoarded by people with full-time positions, how do we convince our senior colleagues to share scarce resources? Okay, so on those notes, I will close and turn the conversation over to my colleague, Jonathan Shu.
Hello, thank you, Kristina, and thank you to ACMRS. Thanks to Ayana, Leah, and Jeff, and all the co-panelists. I'm really glad to be here. Following Kristina, I just want to talk a little bit about building community in and beyond academic medieval studies. On this note, there is an initial bibliography on collaborative and co-authored works in disability studies that's been tweeted out by ACMRS. So my talk, I basically just want to say this, that the future of medieval disability studies is the future of disability justice. Disability work in and beyond academia needs to do three things, essentially. So one is it needs to be intersectional. We need to understand how systems of oppression interact. Disability isn't a problem for one subset of the population or a fixed identity, but rather ableism and associated oppressions are the social problem. Global disability justice is mindful of how disability interacts and is produced with race, gender, class, geography, labor, culture. Two, collaboration. As people have said, we can't claim knowledge of everything. We have to work together across languages, identities, disciplines, locations, communities. Third, solidarity, to reframe some of these threads. Even if as scholars and communities and as activists, we don't all have the same objectives, we can always find moments of interest convergence and work together towards world transformation. So when I name disability justice, I'm actually going to go outside of academia per se. I moved to movements to end ableism and related oppressions. So disability in this framework generates community and collective action and social change. One example is Sins Invalid. This is a disability justice-based performance project led by disabled people of color and disabled queers. The Disability Justice Primer linked in the bibliography is a great starting point for everyone. There's also the Disability Visibility Project. This is a platform for deaf, lowercase d and capital D deaf, disabled, autistic, and neurodivergent people to tell their own stories, many of them about BIPOC-centered social justice. There are a number of anthologies edited by Alice Wong. So this work addresses urgent concerns of ableism, audism, which is discrimination against deaf people based on the norms of hearing culture, which are somehow deemed superior. Also addressing systemic racism and incarceration. So disability justice builds mutual aid and collective care. Disability justice dismantles ableism and believes that a different world is possible. So how does this relate to medieval anything? Well, one example is to bring disability justice frameworks to the past. So I am currently writing a book on first-person stories of disability in medieval Western Europe. I'm interested in writers who self-identified as blind, deaf, or deaf-blind, as well as authors who tell life stories of chronic illness, aging, voice hearing, and mental health. One chapter examines the work of a medieval blind poet, English poet John Gower, who's embraced by later 19th century blind activists who are asserting the full humanity and potential of disabled people across history. Another chapter is looking at the works of a deaf medieval Iberian nun, Teresa de Cartagena, along with her reception by modern contemporary deaf feminists as a kind of ancestor or foremother. So this kind of work historicizes this disability in its own time and crafts communities across space and time. A queer touch across time, as Carolyn Dinshaw would say, or to adapt Elizabeth Freeman, a queer engroupment of disability living, past and present, and into the future. So in her book, in the book Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice, Leah Lakshmi Peepsha Samarasinghe explores how CRIP and queer people of color look to the past to find kinship beyond biological genealogy. And CRIP and queer people of color communities are vital to my understanding of disability, lived disability across time. To echo Cameron, Kristina, we need to think globally and even within academic medieval studies. So even medieval European life stories can invite cross-cultural approaches and anticipate disability justice. Teresa de Cartagena, the deaf nun I mentioned, who wrote in the Castilian vernacular, actually came from a prominent Judeo-Converso family. Her father's generation was born Jewish and converted to Christianity. Her life story, told in Arboleda de los Enfermos, or Grove of the Infirm, is translated into English by Dale Seidenspinner Nunez. Now, to do justice to her life story, we need a collective. We need Iberianists who can situate her 15th century monasticism in the context of women's writing, such as Encarnacion Juarez in disability studies. We also need Hispanic studies, where Teresa is a precursor to the Spanish Saint Teresa de Avila and later author Juana Inés de la Cruz in Mexico. We also need deaf studies, such as the work of Brenda Brueggemann, who places Teresa in a lineage of deaf women across time. Iberianists engaged in Jewish studies are expanding our knowledge of her family background, most notably the collaborative work of Yonso Kim and Seidenspieter Nunez. So this kind of cross-disciplinary and cross-historical work is a scholarship of solidarity. Rick and I have written a co-authored an essay that engages in crip and queer theory, and we note that Teresa's term, enfermos, operates in lieu of a modern term disability, where enfermos means something expansive. It can mean the infirm, disabled, debilitated, sick, vulnerable. So in Teresa's work, an imagined community of enfermos includes blind men, lepers, that is people with Hansen's disease, paralyticos, or so-called cripples, as well as chronically ill and deaf women such as herself. So all of these people become what she calls a sisterhood of infirm people. This legible, contingently legible community of enfermos anticipates some coalitional politics of disability community now. So to keep this short, that's just one example. To keep this short, I won't talk about every item in the bibliography, but the general idea in putting this together was not to be comprehensive, but to suggest a range of collaborative work that continue into the future in and beyond the academy, right? So collaboration across identity positions or lived experiences, even cross-disability work, co-authored essays and criticism, crowdsourced bibliographies, open access publications, multi-authored anthologies, including first-person perspectives, online and in multimodal formats. So we'll just end here to reiterate where we kind of started. This global pandemic reminds us that we are really in all of this together. And I hope that I can end on a note of hope. You know, it can be very hard for us to think about the future when these global crises feel so immediate and urgent. This pandemic is literally creating more disabled people every day, with disastrous effects on BIPOC communities and anyone with so-called underlying conditions, foregrounding the importance of disability justice. So I hope we can continue to craft community, think creatively in and beyond the academy, despite isolation or distance. Academics and activism can join forces to affect social change. And medieval disability studies, whatever it is one community that is part of a global struggle. Thank you.
All right, so as everybody, you can all join us on camera now. As you're coming back on, I first want to say thank you to the four of you. This was just an amazing set of talks, and I think what I love about them is that they speak to each other so well, and I can get a clear sense of the vision of what the future, or more likely futures, can be. And it looks like we've got questions coming in, which I'm very excited to turn to in just a second. So one thing that stuck out for me is that you all are, I think, really thinking about ways in which not just the field, but really the academy can change. And I'm wondering, are there, if we kind of said like in the next 6 months, what would be some concrete steps you think we could start taking now to help develop this future? Is it, are we opening up more collaboration? I think, Kristina, as you mentioned, there is, I think, very real challenges about what higher education as, as a field, as an institution is going to look like in the future. So maybe a little bit of hope and light. What are some of the things we might be able to start doing now?
I think one thing that, and of course, the question is so difficult, what can we do? It always depends on institutional structures and things like that. But I think, speaking to Jonathan's talk, one thing we can do is to really encourage more collaboration, more co-writing and to think about how those things count for junior scholars, for people looking for jobs, what kind of work is being valued, not only in terms of venue of publication, but that, you know, that single authored journal article doesn't always have to be, I think, the end all be all. And I think better work will come as we're working together and speaking to each other.
I think maybe, oh, I'm sorry, Jonathan. Okay. Yeah, so I think dovetailing on that, one way your 6-month time frame kind of suggests a little bit more of an immediacy. And for me, that makes me think of also how can we get discussions of disability, medieval disability in the classroom, right? So what are we prepping for spring? What are we prepping for fall? And so ways to kind of insert the conversation, not just in publications or in this grant application or whatever, but in the classroom, I think would be a really, really good avenue too. And then developing materials for the classroom to support others who might want to do that as well.
Yes, just building on this point relating to teaching and many of the other co-panelists, that I think sometimes we can also think about teaching as kind of the front line, right, for changing the academy. That's where outreach happens, right, face-to-face or virtual. I think part of this is also just incorporating more of a crib time sensibility to our teaching, right, and what we do and what we expect as counting as properly academic. We also need to open our doors to our minds to a broader range of different types of projects, whether they're doing a collaborative online resource like the Disability Glossary, whether you're doing a podcast that can be a valid final project for a course, or thinking about flexibility of how we run things, right? You teach a class virtually, that we can do things synchronously or asynchronously, right? So I do think part of it is just the practical element of how we actually adapt our teaching practices and what we expect from our students as well, as part of a bigger picture.
All right, I want to turn now. We have a bunch of questions coming in, which I'm excited about. I'm going to start with the big one. So is medieval disability studies in a second wave? And are waves even useful metaphors for the new directions that fields take over time?
Can I say yes and no and not defend my answer?
You can, but do you have a little bit more on why yes and no?
Well, that I think yes, in some ways where we are in a bit of a second wave. I'm not sure if it's second and a half, third. In some ways, I don't know if it's quite useful to think about the demarcation, but there is something about the wave of coming up and down and dissolving and forming, and waves in historical periods, maybe not, but the actual wave does feel, I think, more useful as a way of thinking.
I like the idea of a wave in terms of thinking in material forms of the metaphor, that we're thinking about motion, reverberation, ripple effects. I like that. Right. So I think it's, it's hard for us to be in a pandemic and not think of a second or third wave in a disastrous sense, right? But I think there's other ways we can think about kind of ripple effects. So I like this idea of reverberation or motion. So that's what I would take from the wave metaphor. I guess that's what I like about that question.
Cameron or Kristina, did you have thoughts you wanted to add? I think actually building on this, another question that speaks to kind of the larger issue of interdisciplinary that I think all of you were getting into. So this question is, how might medieval disability studies be more inclusive of scholars who work in medieval philosophy, that is, scholars trained in philosophy rather than literature? In my experience, scholars of medieval philosophy are interested in expanding medieval philosophy to include disability, but there are many questions about how to do this. So, and I think that goes for, for all of us, like we have these ideas in our own fields of how to do this, but how do we kind of make that jump fields?
I don't know. That is an interesting question. Oh, I'm sorry. Cameron, why don't you go first? Okay. Well, I would say that's an interesting question. I'm not so sure about Western European philosophies, but if I think of, the philosophers I have studied, they generally aren't talking so much about questions like this, although questions about physical bodies, it's more abstract, of course, and spirit and soul. But I do know someone who is coming out, or he's proposing a collected volume on disabled philosophers, Muslim philosophers. So I could pull up his name in a moment, but I think maybe, at least for now, that seems like one of the more promising avenues of discovery, and maybe how their own embodiment shaped some ideas.
Yeah, I think to build on that, I would advocate for people who are doing collections or anthologies, whatever, to make sure that they're interdisciplinary, so that the call is open to not just literature or history or what have you. And I think I said I lean Western, I lean British, and so a lot of my work is in that Christian and Western tradition, but that philosophical inquiry in that tradition does overlap a lot with discussions of disability. So those kinds of entries would, fit right in with volumes on drama and literature and history and religion and anything else.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on a few points about kind of the critical vocabulary and how it creates institutional or disciplinary silos, right? So I think it actually makes a difference whether we call something philosophy or whether we call something theory, right? Philosophers and theorists can often be doing similar things, but they aren't talking to each other. They aren't reading each other's work. I think another productive avenue to think about is theology, that there is a lot of social justice oriented, disability justice oriented theology that's happening right now. And so I think I don't have those names to mind, but I think it also means looking beyond kind of our disciplinary boxes and thinking in a more broader way of what counts as philosophy. So I think that could be another way of rethinking or reframing the questions.
Yeah, no, I think those are absolutely some great points. And another kind of small question that's come up out of that, just have you all seen exciting work specifically with material and visual culture of medieval disability? The person asked, they say much of what they're seeing focuses on textual sources.
I can maybe not answer that as well, but to say that like in the source book, I think we have a handful of images that discuss disability, and that's it. And that one, there's been, there were kind of two, I think, general hurdles to that work. And one was the way that like the British Library and collections of medieval images tag their images. So it's very difficult to search for any kind of disability or impairment related terms and get those images. So it's, and there's people out there doing that kind of work, but that the current state of the field makes it really difficult to sift through those images. I think the Morgan Library is the only one right now that includes tags or subject tags that would be, that would include impairments. And then the other hurdle for us was the financial cost of permissions for the images. So I think that a volume that might focus exclusively on those is going to carry a cost with it for reproducing those images.
Yes, I would agree with Cameron's point about kind of the infrastructure problem. So I'm also thinking about something like the Index of Medieval Art, formerly the Index of Christian Art, but Index of Medieval Art. I've been having some similar conversations with people who work on with the index about, well, I'm writing this book on on deafness and disability. How do we actually find images? And that can be difficult, right? Because the whole structure of apparatus of the index constrains how we find these images. I think these questions of like, we do have to look to art history to think about, where a lot of this work is happening. I also think we need to think out of the box a bit. So I'm thinking about Kristina's work on some of the early pre-modern history of the prehistory of sign languages. People who work on deaf history work a lot with visual culture as evidence for deaf-oriented or deaf-inclusive modes of communication, right? Or possibly deaf-inclusive modes of communication in the pre-modern period. So I think if we can reframe some of these questions in terms of kind of who are the current communities who are using visual material evidence, maybe for a different aim than we're used to as literature scholars, then we can start to ask different questions and look in different places. I don't know, there might be a different disciplinary question, on the basis of literature versus history that is something that is worth asking about, but at least for literary and cultural studies, that would be my answer to the question. My other answer to the question is media studies. So media studies is doing a lot in the realm of digital cultures, disability and accessibility, disability and technology. Well, writing is a technology, medieval material culture is technology as well. So if we think about media history, then yes, there's a longue array where medievalist material culture scholars going back to the Middle Ages and further can also move into that stream too.
Just to chime in very briefly, just want to kind of echo some of the issues of access and of just availability. So the book that I'm working on is about prosthetics and prosthesis, but kind of in the age before what we typically think of as prosthetics. And I'm thinking more of literary representations in text. But myself, I am interested in those physical objects. And it's hard to get to the museums and the archives to see them. But I think it was May, I attended a virtual talk at the Royal Armory about like late 15th, early 16th century prosthetic arms. And it was fantastic. And while I hate the pandemic, I wouldn't have been able to hear the lecture if it ran as always. And so again, it's this question of access is not only a question for our field, but it's a question for all fields of study and learning and teaching.
Well, maybe I could just very quickly say, if anyone's interested in images from the Islamic context, there is a website, islamicpaintedpage.com, and they do actually tag. They don't picture every single image that they tag, but most of them are pictured. If not, they give you the reference, obviously, of the archive or book where you can find it. So that's a good place to start. I know the Staatsbibliothek zu Berlin also, in their manuscript portal, they have a section where you can search for images. I've only done it, of course, for Islamic ones, but I wonder if for Western manuscripts it's the same. And I agree with this question. I mean, that also, because I'm raising a teenager who must take in thousands of images a day. And I just think maybe this is a generation that's going to be better prepared to analyze images than ever. So that would be a really productive way to bring people into the field, new scholars, et cetera, and students. Yeah, maybe I'll end right there. But yeah, there's a lot of promise, I should say, with visual history for our field.
There's a question that might kind of dovetail off this really well. And I think gets back to this question of interdisciplinary. So how do you all feel that a field like the history of science fits in with or against medieval disability studies? Do you see some intersections there? Do you see them kind of achieving different goals? What are your thoughts here? Jonathan, I see you nodding. Do you have ideas?
I'm still trying to think through that question. I would say one way of answering it is kind of what I said before, is like, well, there are people who are working in the history of science or medical humanities, for instance, who are working on issues related to disability. And I think it's a matter of kind of that interest convergence, right? How do we find shared investments? And we might not be using the same language or critical vocabularies to discuss things, but we're interested in similar questions, right? So I think that's the important thing to emphasize. I think maybe part of our, I'm guessing, maybe part of our collective hesitation is that disability studies scholars are like a little allergic of medical models, right? So I think there's a little bit, that's why we're a little hesitant to even answer the question, maybe. So I think, yeah, I think that's kind of what we're trying to grapple with, right? Is that maybe the flip side of it is, yeah, there's some barriers to interdisciplinary cross-silo conversations that we have to try to work to surmount. That's my question. I mean, my general answer was yes, of course, history of science and history of medicine, everybody needs to work together, like, so that's my answer to that generally in terms of the broader question. I would say for me, just in terms of my own reading and teaching, I would say the work that's happening in medical humanities is the most generative, patient-centered medical humanities. And maybe it's because I'm thinking about first-person narrative, but that is where I see, okay, that's interest convergence I can work with, and we can come together on it, even if we're coming from different investment, if we have different investments.
Oh no, you muted your camera. There you are. We've got a few minutes left. So I wanted to turn briefly, I think, at least at the end, to kind of questions of how to deal with some of these things in the classroom, as we've mentioned a little bit. I'm going to paraphrase this because it's a longer question, but this is from a PhD student who has a cognitive disability, and kind of asking about how to address issues of disability within the classroom. They say they found academia very ableist space, and because they work on disability, they often get the question, "Are you disabled?" But the question here is kind of how might you approach this as a more nuanced conversation? Right? How can academia be held accountable to include disabled scholars with the idea that not all disabilities are visible, and especially when you're kind of navigating all the issues within the classroom space?
I'll start just because I'm thinking of it. I think one area, at least from a faculty perspective, is outreach to other faculty. The J. Dolmaj is a work on academic ableism, Margaret Price, Mad at School, right? So these are works that come out of disability studies, education studies that say, well, we need to think more expansively about how we teach and learn and what our norms are for that. And we also need to think about ableism as structural in the academy. I think something that's sometimes helpful in terms of outreach to faculty, at least, is to reemphasize that we all embody disability at some point in our lives, right? That's true, and as people get older, illness, pandemic makes that clear. So I hope that there's more kind of empathy and awareness and sensitivity to that. I do think questions of neurodiversity and social stigma in the academy in particular do need to be addressed. There's a lot of misunderstanding that needs to be addressed. I think a big part of it is, I guess, just communicating with faculty as well, and trying to advocate for your own needs if you're a disabled person. And finding your allies in your department or your program who can help advocate for you. That could be another route. I'm just thinking of a couple possibilities here.
Definitely, I would echo a lot of what Jonathan just said, and kind of thinking about his example earlier about like letting students do things like podcasts for final projects, and working in choice is something I do. I let my students do podcasts, final projects. I have students doing paintings, crochet dolls that they interpret. It's fantastic stuff. But the bigger point is, and I think this is coming out of Jay Delmage's work, is treating disability not as an accommodation, something that we're reacting to, but planning for it and thinking, I'm hesitant about the term universal design sometimes, but using that more as a principle of planning in choice and redundancy and option, and letting students have different paths as much as we're able to. There's a question of labor there as well that we need to be resonant to, but rather than an ableist pedagogy is one that assumes there's only one right way to do it. And the more we can think differently, I think it makes it easier for those who identify as disabled and chronically ill to navigate through.
Cameron or Kristina, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Just very briefly, and I was trying to be sensitive to time, but just that, I think that a medieval disability studies that is for scholars by scholars, and is insular in that way, is not going to have a very strong future. So it needs to get in the classroom in whatever ways, that we can. And that can even be just a gen ed, if you're teaching a survey or something, like including one or two texts that you look at from a disability lens, or one or two texts that maybe overtly address disability, like some of the texts that Jonathan was talking about, or just whatever, but that disability needs a stronger presence in the classroom in all aspects, whether it's course design, content, what have you. And then just, I think that cumulatively that strong presence will work incrementally, hopefully, to change the field and academia.
That made me think of, I just saw a tweet like yesterday that talked about, I think it was when people talk about career scholarship, it often kind of ends up on the end of their syllabus at the time that's going to be like most hectic for everyone and most likely for them to pay attention to. So I was thinking even too, as you're saying, right, bringing in those texts and thinking about them through disability lens, like maybe doing that early in the course, right? So there's time devoted to it early, and that sets a precedent in a different way. So unfortunately, as always, we're out of time. There are so many questions that we could spend all day getting to. So first off, thank you to the four of you. This was such a brilliant conversation. As an early modernist, I have learned so much about the work that's being done and where we need to go with things. So thank you again for taking the time to speak with us today. To all of those of you who joined us online and for your brilliant questions that we weren't able to get to all of them, thank you again for joining us. And we hope to see you in a couple weeks for Runaway Ecologies, and then in January for Race Before Race Education. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your week.